Sejam muito bem-vindos. Welcome to the digital seminar, The Importance of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights on the Road to the Social Summit, a national committee for the human rights initiatives within the scope of the Portuguese presidency of the European Council. As most areas of our lives, human rights have suffered strong consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic that we are all facing now for more than a year. So it's of utmost importance that we give a close look to the ones who suffered the most. To go beyond the diagnosis and look for cures is the opportunity that has been given to us today by getting together some of the most important leaders, researchers and thinkers about human rights. This webinar will be an important contribution to the Porto Summit, where the political and social European plan will be discussed starting next Friday. As a journalist, I'm mostly fond of questions, so it is with great expectation that I look forward for the audience's questions that will be answered before the end of the session. You can write your questions using the functionality Q&A at your Zoom platform, indicating to whom you are addressing to. We have 1.5 hours for it all, so a huge task ahead of us. Let's get started. Our first guest is Francisco André, Foreign Ministers and Cooperation Secretary of State and President of the National Commission for Human Rights. Please.
Thank you, Isabel. Good morning to everyone, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me first of all to thank you, Isabel, for accepting our invitation to host and to moderate this debate today. To thank the video messages that we are going to watch nextly by Michelle Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and also from Nicolas Schmidt, the European Commissioner for Employment and Social Rights. I would like to greet some of our guest speakers today. I would like to greet Gabriel Bastos, Secretary of State for Social Security, my good friend. Also Olivier de Schutter, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Luca Vizentini, Secretary General of the European Trade Union Confederation. Also Maurizio Bussi, the Deputy Regional Director of ILO. Jean-Marc Coirin, President of the Civil Society Europe, Virginia Braz Gomes, also here with us today, Senior Social Policy Advisor and former Chair of the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and also Professor Teresa Pizarro Bleza. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to warmly welcome you to this session dedicated to the economic, social and cultural rights organized in the framework of the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union. The Portuguese National Human Rights Committee, which is the national mechanism for implementation, reporting and follow-up of our human rights obligations, has been actively working to promote and protect all human rights. This reinforced engagement of ours was particularly needed to counter the negative effects of the current pandemic, which has exacerbated existing structural inequalities in our societies and among countries, increased poverty, social and economic exclusion, and also reversed gains made in the realization of economic, social and cultural rights. Indeed, there is an enormous burden being placed on national health systems worldwide. Hospitals are overstretched, essential healthcare is being denied or postponed in order to respond to COVID-related urgencies. Mental health issues are increasing considerably, and there is an evident shortage of human and material resources such as medicines and vaccines for a timely response to the pandemic crisis. The importance of the realization of the right to health and of universal health coverage have been made abundantly clear, but other rights have also been put to the test by confinement measures and restriction of movement, like education. And this should be a clear reminder of the interdependence and indivisibility of all human rights. Portugal implemented a range of legal and policy measures to try to mitigate these negative effects. My esteemed colleague, the Secretary of State for Social Security, Gabriel Bastos, will give us later the honor to close this session and may touch on some of them. In the context of the work done by the Portuguese National Human Rights Committee, it will be important to recall the publication of the document Portugal and the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights in Times of the COVID-19 Pandemic. This document brings together in a systematic manner the main measures taken in the early stages of the pandemic to promote and protect human rights. It also serves as a reference information and was also recognized by the Secretary-General of the Council of Europe as a testament to Portugal's commitment to the Council of Europe's values and standards. All human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent and interrelated. However, for historical reasons, a de facto divide emerged early. When the Universal Declaration was still being negotiated, economic, social and cultural rights were treated, and still are, as less important than civil and political rights. This divide was also reflected at structural level by the absence of an international complaint mechanism and by the different status of the committees that monitor the implementation of both covenants. In the 1980s, when Portugal started to claim a role at the international human rights fora, the promotion, protection and fulfillment of economic, social and cultural rights were a logic priority aligned with our Constitution. We started by introducing resolutions on the economic, social and cultural rights in the Commission on Human Rights. A few years later, we proposed the establishment of the first special procedure in this area, the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, and we also established an intergovernmental working group to discuss a possible optional protocol to the International Covenant on the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which was finally adopted in 2008 on the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration, allowing individuals to present complaints and seek redress for violation of these rights. Last March, during the session of the Human Rights Council, we presented the resolution on economic, social and cultural rights with a focus on the recovery post-COVID-19 because we must prepare our societies for future crises. Portugal's long-standing commitment to human rights is reflected in our EU presidency program and in our goal to build a more resilient, cohesive, equal and prosperous union, doing full justice to the principle of leaving no one behind. Promoting a European recovery boosted by green and digital transitions and delivering on the EU's social pillar are key elements for ensuring this objective. As expressed in the resolution presented by Portugal and co-sponsored by 70 states representing all regional groups, efforts to build back better will require the adoption of robust and efficient public policies, the implementation of adequately resourced and fully functioning services, and the cooperation at national, regional and international levels. The Porto Social Summit that will take place later this week aims to give a political impetus to the implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights and its action plan, underlining its central role in European recovery and the adaptation to the climate, digital and demographic transitions. It will also provide an opportunity to reinforce dialogue with social partners and with citizens, paying particular attention to employment, equal opportunities, social protection and health. Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot finish without expressing my deepest gratitude to all speakers, moderators and participants. I am convinced that today's event will provide a valuable and timely contribution to the Social Summit, and I would like to wish you all a fruitful discussion. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary of State. We will now listen to a pre-recorded message from Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Greetings to all of you. This is a welcome initiative and it confirms Portugal's consistent leadership on economic, social and cultural rights issues over the past 20 years. It was Portugal that ably steered the talks which led to adoption of the optional protocol of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, coinciding with the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 2008. That achievement has enabled victims to seek justice for violations of their economic, social and cultural rights at the international level. And it has brought more balance to the international system to protect and promote all human rights. Economic, social and cultural rights are essential to human dignity. The COVID-19 pandemic has underscored the vital role they play in upholding a sound society and resilient, sustainable economy. The pandemic exploited deficiencies in healthcare, social protection, housing, sanitation, decent work conditions, and education systems. It Those deficiencies far worse, shattering entire sectors of the global economy, throwing millions of people into poverty, pushing healthcare system towards breakdown, and depriving millions of children of education. And it demonstrated how badly those human rights protection gaps harm not only the individuals directly affected, but also, more broadly, all of society. As the Human Rights Council's Resolution 46/10 asserts, to ensure a more resilient recovery, the current crisis can and should become the catalyst for a transformative advancement of economic, social, and cultural rights, beginning now. In the coming month, states will inevitably be making massive investments in rebuilding economies and societies. I urge policymakers to invest considerable resources in quality public services, including comprehensive health and social systems. Universal social protection is a key lever that facilitates access to health care, protects people against poverty, and ensures that future generations can thrive. It also helps to protect women, half the population, from shouldering an incapacitating and disproportionate burden of care work. This unpaid burden of care suffered by many women has increased sharply over the past 15 months, with heavy long-term impact on women's access to formal employment, decent wages, and proper social security protections in the future. Addressing these challenges is not a special favor. It is an investment in better functioning economy and a fundamental human right. International human rights law is clear that states must use maximum available resources to advance economic, social, and cultural rights, and that budgets for essential goods and services should be ring-fenced. This may require progressive taxation, measures to strengthen capacity to collect taxes and to fight tax evasion, and steps to tackle corruption. I view it as crucial for the European Union to exercise collective leadership in combating inequalities and ensuring that no one is left behind within and outside its borders. Ensuring that countries both within and outside the European Union can step up their health and social protection systems, including their access to vaccines, is among the most sound investments the EU can make. I welcome the implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights. I encourage you to draw upon the content and guidance of the international human rights law system in your efforts. I urge comprehensive and meaningful participation by all key actors in drawing up and implementing its measures, including employers and workers' representatives and civil society, but also, and crucially, local authorities and national human rights institutions. I also encourage the inclusion of clear and time-bound targets and ensure that this work is made accountable to the public. My hope is that, based on this momentum, we can ensure that social protection, health, and other economic, social, and cultural rights are no longer viewed as theoretical aspirations, but treated and guaranteed as the rights they are. I look forward to your expert discussions.
Thank you. It is now time to listen to another pre-recorded message, this time from Nicholas Schmidt, European Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me first thank the Portuguese presidency for today's conference, but also for making the human dimension a key priority of its presidency. In 2021, like never before, this human dimension has to be front and center. We have to act for our young generations who had barely recovered from the financial crisis when the pandemic struck. We have to act for the many women whose opportunities at work do not match their talents. We also have to act to help workers who fear for their job as the world of work and our economies change, and support them to be better equipped for new jobs. Let me here make a special reference to artists and workers in the cultural sector who have seen their activities grind to a halt throughout the pandemic, with dramatic consequences for their revenue. And we have to act for those who are marginalized in our societies. They may be unemployed, They may face discrimination, or they may be homeless, but all have something in common. They do not feel that they belong in our societies, and many have lost trust in our capacity or willingness to include them. The Porto Social Summit will be the opportunity to make a difference. It will be the occasion for governments, civil society, social partners, and other organizations to promote everyone's economic, social, and cultural rights in the recovery. It will be about bringing solidarity, stability, and optimism in difficult times. This agenda is supported by the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan, an action plan to make sure societies build back better and together, driven by the value of social justice, which we hold high. This action plan stands for what collectively we believe in. It will help fight child poverty, poor housing, and precarious work. It will help invest in training, in health, and in public services, because public services are our common goods, and sometimes the only goods accessible to many. Ladies and gentlemen, some of you today are in Belem's Cultural Center. It is one of thousands of places throughout the continent where Europeans express their creativity and share their knowledge. We miss these cultural events and activities terribly. They give us energy, spark our imagination, and enrich our lives. And most importantly, they bring us closer together. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a fruitful conference.
Thank you. Next, we will have an experienced professional in humanitarian operations at the United Nations, the Deputy Regional Director of Europe and Central Asia, Maurizio Bussi.
Thank you very much. It is a true pleasure to be with you today and greet you all from Geneva on behalf of ILO's Director General, Guy Ryder. I wish to thank the Portuguese Presidency of the EU and the National Human Rights Committee for this kind invitation and for convening this meeting. Let me begin by saying something about the times we are in. Who among us does not feel unmoored? The flow of events, their scale and strangeness, and sheer volume posing one another unprecedented societal and personal challenge of obvious urgency is overwhelming. And this is an understatement. It has been an incomprehensible mix of momentous change, weary monotony, unfamiliar hardships, and at times, unescapable sadness. And yet, nothing can be more important right now than reaffirming the power of our fundamental principles and values. Never have our society more desperately needed to reap the benefits of our shared ideals, newly discovered knowledge, and the pursuit of truth. Last Saturday, we celebrated for the second year in a row the International Workers' Day under the shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic has unquestionably reminded us of the need to place the human being at the heart of policies. It has also made us well aware of the high cost it takes for neglecting it. Ladies and gentlemen, the ILO has played a pioneering role in the promotion of economic and social rights. Since our foundation in 1919, the founders of the ILO put human dignity and social justice at the center of the organization's mandate and work. The Preamble of the Ilo Constitution begin with the well-known statement that universal peace can be established only if it's based upon social justice. It also enshrined as priority for action several fundamental rights. These include freedom of association, health promotion, protection of children, young people, women, and migrant workers. In short, our economic and social rights. The Second World War has accelerated revolutionary changes in international law, with the UN Charter Preamble proclaiming that promotion of social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom as one of its main aims. The 1944 ILO Philadelphia Declaration, our Magna Carta, stated that labor is not a commodity. Freedom of expression and association are essential to sustain progress. All human beings, irrespective of race, creed, or sex, have the right to pursue both their material well-being and their spiritual development in conditions of freedom and dignity, of economic security and equal opportunity. This is the essence of the ILO, which never relinquished in its quest for social justice what we call now decent work. This notion is not an abstract conception of human rights in general. It is a real human-centered agenda needed for a decent future of work, as enshrined in the ILO 2019 Centenary Declaration, which we have adopted just a few months before the pandemic outbreak. These fundamental rights, as envisioned in the Ilo Constitution and the Declaration of Philadelphia, have been canonized in the 48 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the 1950 European Declaration of Human Rights, and in the two 1966 International Covenants, respectively on civil and political rights and not economic, social and cultural rights. Here, I must insist on the universality, indivisibility, and interdependence of all human rights. As rightly said by Wilfred Jacks, one of our former ILO Director General, social justice cannot be divorced from the context of political freedom, civil liberties, economic progress, and cultural vitality. In his conception, the ILO would de facto become an executing agency of the Covenant, thanks to the International Labour Code formed by our international labour standards. Most ILO instruments reflect this interdependence and the interconnectivity between the ILO and the UN system. Enough to mention is the 2019 joint statement of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and the Human Rights Committee issued on the occasion of the ILO centenary. Both reaffirm the importance of the freedom of association principles common to both covenants and protected by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ILO. Yes, we all pursue common goals. We complement each other through our respective instruments and supervisory systems. Ladies and gentlemen, the world, including the EU, is going through untested, turbulent times, both at global and European levels. We should continue to orient our action with the tools available: the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the ILO human-centered approach of the Centenary Declaration, and the ILO policy framework for tackling the economic and social impact of COVID-19. Such priorities are already enshrined in the European Pillar for Social Rights. The EU and the ILO share a vision of society based on the rights and dignity of people, capable of delivering economic efficiency, sustainability, and decent work for all. The social pillar is key in this regard. We are looking forward to the launch of its action plan in the Porto Summit next week. The ILO will remain faithful to its social vocation and is now aiming at the adoption by the next International Labour Conference in June of a tripartite call to action for a human-centered recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. We count on your continuous engagement in supporting this important initiative for a rights-based future of work. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you all for the enlightening interventions, calling our attention to the fact that a more prosperous union depends on social and human rights, on the fact that human rights are an investment, but also on the problem that this made clear that there is a loss of confidence that we need to regain, and this confidence will be better gained through social justice. This has also been a time of silence, and that can only be solved reaffirming the power of values. I'm sure these are all good pretexts for many questions, so once again I remind you we will have time for Q&A at the end. It's now time to give the floor to Olivier de Schutter, UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, who also in 2021 chaired the Council of Europe's high-level expert group on social rights in Europe.
Many thanks indeed, and very warm welcome to all the colleagues on this important panel organized by the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the EU. Let me say a few words about the key conclusions I draw from my mission to the EU starting on 24th of November 2020 and that closed on 29th of January of this year. The purpose of the mission was really to assess the efforts of the EU to combat poverty, and I was struck in my mission by the openness of my interlocutors, including Commissioner Nicolas Schmidt, whom we just heard, and Pascal Donoghue, the Minister of Finance of Ireland, President of the Eurogroup, and I was really impressed by their willingness to engage. I think we also were all impressed by the reactivity of the EU to the COVID-19 pandemic. Many taboos have fallen. The rules on state aid were relaxed. The general escape clause to the Stability and Growth Pact was activated. For the first time, the EU will be authorized to borrow on the international markets on behalf of the 27 member states to finance Next Generation EU, in particular, the Recovery and Resilience Facility for 750 billion euros. Now, these are very important achievements. However, I would like to express two concerns. The first concern is that the structural factors that create obstacles to the fight against poverty at member state level have not been addressed. We still face a union in which there is social competition between the EU, in which some member states believe that they could improve their external cost competitiveness by limiting the increase of wages and social contributions from employers. And as a result, we have some 9 million working poor in the EU, largely as a result of the increase in non-standard forms of employment, zero-hour contracts, mini-jobs, workers of the platform gig economy. And that is why the proposal for a new directive on adequate minimum wage presented on 28th of October 2020 is so important. Secondly, we still have fiscal competition between states, a race to the bottom that is organized in the area of taxation on corporate income in particular. That is why the average corporate income tax in the EU has been decreasing by 11% over the past 20 years, despite the existence of a code of conduct on business taxation since 1997 and the work of the European Code of Conduct Group to monitor compliance. The EU, of course, has not remained inactive on this front. It has adopted anti-tax avoidance directives. An agreement was found on 25th of February of this year on a country-by-country reporting for large multinational enterprises. However, the principle according to which competition between states has positive impacts, justifying the unanimity rule for fiscal harmonization in the EU, this principle remains unchallenged. Thirdly, we have the Stability and Growth Pact and the Treaty on Stability, Coordination and Governance of 2012 that impose to maintain public deficits under control and to control the public debt. And that remains formally in force, although no distinction is made in this system between, on the one hand, social investment, which creates the conditions for future inclusive growth, and on the other hand, other expenses. And I think that deserves a very profound revision that I hope in the post-recovery period we will be able to make. My second proviso concerns the role of social rights in the EU integrating process. That role of social rights remains quite marginal. First, there is a strong imbalance between civil and political rights on the one hand, and economic, social, and cultural rights on the other hand, in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which only includes social rights to the extent they are not considered as purely programmatic, and which, following its adaptation to allow its insertion in the treaties with the Treaty of Lisbon, distinguishes between rights that can be directly invoked before courts and principles which can only be invoked against certain measures or to guide the interpretation of other measures under Article 52, paragraph 5 of the Charter. The European Pillar of Social Rights is important, but it is not a substitute for this imbalance. The European Pillar of Social Rights is a political program, a guide for legislative action. It is not a set of rights, of entitlements, which may be invoked before courts. And let me take one very clear example. Principle 14 is on minimum income, and it states everyone lacking sufficient resources has the right to adequate minimum income benefits, ensuring a life in dignity at all stages of life, and effective access to enabling goods and services. However, despite the demand of civil society and despite there being a legal basis for this, the Commission proposes today in its action plan to implement the European Pillar of Social Rights nothing more than a new Council recommendation, a non-binding instrument in order to implement this promise of Principle 14 of the European Pillar. The third example of this imbalance between rights is that there is no systematic impact assessment on poverty or on social rights of the EU policies or legislation, of the national recovery and resilience plans filed under the Recovery and Resilience Facility, or indeed of the memoranda of understanding concluded with countries benefiting from support from the European Stability Mechanism. Despite the commitment made in 2014, when the Commission of Jean-Claude Juncker took office, to ensure that greater attention should be paid, and I quote, to the social fairness of new macroeconomic adjustment programs to ensure that the adjustment is spread equitably and to protect the most vulnerable in society. That promise has not been kept. Fourth, in the EU's law and policy making, occasional references are made to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and indeed to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which the EU is a party of. However, very few references are made to Council of Europe instruments in the field of social rights, the European Social Charter, and hardly any reference at all is made to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Although this could facilitate the search for consensus in the EU across the member states on certain important topics, such as the adequate minimum wage, such as minimum income schemes. References to the European Social Charter and to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights could strengthen the credibility of the EU in its international relations, as it imposes itself compliance with standards that it seeks to have imposed on others. It will also avoid creating a situation in which member states are imposed conflicting obligations, respectively under EU law or as a result of their membership in the EU and under international human rights law. Remember, for example, that under the European Social Charter, the reform of the Swedish labor legislation that followed the Laval judgment of the European Court of Justice in 2007 resulted in a finding from the European Committee of Social Rights that Sweden was in violation of the European Social Charter. And we have a number of cases concerning Greece in which the economic reforms adopted by Greece following the bailouts of 2010 and 2012 were considered to be in violation with the European Social Charter, for example, with respect to access to youth to employment or to the level of pensions. Now, this is why the high-level group of experts on social rights appointed by the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, that I had the honor of chairing, recommended that a process be launched towards the EU's accession to the European Social Charter, as recommended many times by the European Parliament. This was endorsed very recently on 22nd of April by the Secretary General of the Council of Europe in her proposals to improve the implementation of social rights in Europe in advance of the Berlin ministerial meeting of the Council of Europe on 21st of May. The accession of the EU to the European Social Charter is listed among the 4 priority issues that a conference of the parties to the European Social Charter should be addressing in 2022 or 2023. Let me conclude by saying that the EU can be proud of the standards of living achieved on the continent and of the welfare systems that the member states have developed. But we still have 92 million people in Europe that are at risk of poverty or social exclusion. 19 million children, 23% of children in Europe are still at risk of poverty. And neither the socio-economic framework of the EU and its macroeconomic tools, such as the European semester, nor the current tools developed to guide the economic recovery are grounded in social rights as rights, with the elements of participation, accountability, and entitlements that this entails. Enormous goodwill is expressed, and there's a genuine desire to move forward. I'm therefore optimistic that we shall see further progress on this front. We can and we must do better for Europeans. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you very much. We will now listen to Virginia Braz Gomes, Senior Social Policy Advisor and member of the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights for 14 years.
Thank you. Warm greetings to you all from our beautiful city of Lisboa. The impact of the COVID pandemic has been devastating, but perhaps it has had one positive consequence of making governments and societies aware of the relevance of the enjoyment of economic, social and cultural rights during and post-adverse situations that arrive unexpectedly, change living and working patterns without warning, and exacerbate previously existing structural inequalities. Governments were faced with a number of interconnected challenges in order to mitigate the effects of the pandemic, trying to reconcile public health needs with efforts to keep the economy going. Specific measures were also essential to replace work-related income, guarantee workers' rights and universal access to health care, provide distance learning, and ensure social security benefits. Though the pandemic situation is still complex, we are hopeful that slowly our lives will regain some kind of normalcy. It is time to take stock and for governments, international bodies, national human rights institutions, social partners, civil society organizations, and all other stakeholders to work together in reversing the losses, in promoting sustained recovery efforts, and above all, in building back better. Using the framework enshrined in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, ratified by all the European Union member states, there are 6 points I would like to put forward as a contribution to the implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights and its action plan. First and foremost, to reinforce the indivisibility and interdependence of all human rights. When an enemy is at the gates or a disease in the streets, some extraordinary measures are necessary. Lockdowns, for example, have saved millions of lives. But in some countries, a flawed vision of what to fear during an emergency led to the shrinking of democratic space and unjustified restrictions on the enjoyment of civil and political rights. In many others, the combined effects of poverty, non-standard forms of employment, lack of income and access to resources and to quality social services, as well as inadequate housing and public transportation conditions, led to increased infection and transmission rates and avoidable deaths. There is no clearer confirmation that effective protection of human rights requires the recognition that they are indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent on one hand, and require the implementation of coherent and integrated programs and initiatives on the other. The second point is that cross-cutting non-discrimination and substantive equality provisions are essential to deal with inequality in all its forms. States have not been successful in dealing with intersectional or compounded discrimination, and the particularly negative and long-lasting effects it has on women and persons belonging to vulnerable groups. It is time for governments to go beyond sectoral anti-discrimination regulations and to enact framework legislation against discrimination that would provide the overarching legal architecture to combat the root causes of inequalities that have become even more visible during the pandemic. The third point is a call to attention to the use of maximum available resources for progressive realization that seems to have come to some kind of a standstill across the board. Unfortunately, all over the world, cutting social expenditure without carrying out the necessary reflection on the adverse impact such cuts may have on the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights has led to increased inequalities, to the weakening of the role of universal public policies, and to pushing individuals and families into situations of poverty or increasing their risk of falling through the cracks of various protection systems. Even when governments have assessed the impact of individual welfare reform policies, they have not considered the combined or aggregate impact that several of the welfare reforms coming together could have on the same group of people. Building back better post-COVID calls for the recognition once and for all that insufficient fulfillment of economic, social, and cultural rights is not only due to lack of resources, but also, and perhaps above all, to domestic priorities that do not attribute sufficient relevance to these rights. As citizens and professionals, we all know the difference between non-participation, token participation, and real citizen power that demands accountability. Therefore, my fourth point is a renewed appeal for the meaningful participation of rights holders as an essential human rights principle. Particularly in terms of adversity, inclusive processes that reinforce substantive participation and empowerment help people deal with the consequences of powerlessness. Even swift and dramatic actions such as lockdowns and travel bans can be implemented in an open and democratic manner, respecting fundamental freedoms. Open, participatory, and meaningful dialogue with different groups in society is not only a means to ensure their voices are heard and their rights respected, but also an important policy tool that can offer a range of practical measures to prevent conflict and build more cohesive societies. My fifth point is a reminder that the existence of social safety nets to cushion the unwanted or unexpected effects of crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, should be considered a national and international political priority in the context of sustainable development policies. The effects of climate change and environmental degradation on the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights are far from being totally understood. For recovery efforts to be successful, these linkages have to be fully reflected in present and future public policies. My sixth and final point concern efforts to rethink and reorganize the role of states that continue to grapple with the need to balance long-term financial sustainability concerns with the fulfillment of their overall function of ensuring an acceptable level of protection to all their citizens, especially the most vulnerable. The co-responsibility of central and local administration authorities on one hand and of public and private providers on the other in no way decreases the final responsibility of the state, particularly for those most in need of protection. The pandemic has made that crystal clear by revealing the danger of chronic underfunding and scaling down of public systems that negatively impact their capacity to provide quality services and respond in a timely and effective manner to unexpected emergencies. COVID-19 is probably just one of the many threats we will face over the coming years. To deal with them effectively, we need national contexts that are more responsive to the rights of individuals, families, and groups, and new modalities of international cooperation based on solidarity, shared responsibility, mutual respect, and complementarity. Crises bring both danger and opportunity. We are trying to deal with the danger as best we can. Future generations will not forgive us if we do not seize the opportunities to build back better for us and for them. Many thanks, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Next, we will have an intervention from Luca Vizentini, European Trade Union Confederation General Secretary, who has also taken part in negotiations at EU level on the European Pillar of Social Rights.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for having invited me to participate in this very interesting and important discussion. And I'm really positively impressed by the messages that have been delivered so far by the different speakers. So I will not dedicate too much time to describe again what the effects of the pandemic have been on economic, social and cultural rights in the European Union. By the way, as many have already said, these effects have just exacerbated inequalities and problems that we had faced also in the previous phase. We can never forget about the horrible effects of austerity policies and troika unwanted interventions on different member states in the aftermath of the economic and financial crisis. That period of the European history was really unfortunate because it destroyed really the foundation of our social model and of our constitutional rights and also the fundamental rights that are at the basis of the European architecture. And of course, this incredible level of inequalities and the different measures that had undermined already after the economic and financial crisis our set of rights and the European social and democratic acquis, all this has been threatened even further by the consequences of the pandemic. But the problem now is not just to analyze what the horrible effects of these different crises, one after the other, have had on our society, but to try to see if we can find solutions to overcome this situation. And in this respect, I think that we have three extraordinary opportunities in front of us, in few days, by the way. The first one is, of course, the Porto Summit, the social summit that the Portuguese presidency has decided to organize, and we are very grateful to the Portuguese presidency for doing so. But then following, we will have also the launch of the conference on the future of Europe, and during these days, each and every member state of the European Union is discussing and negotiating with the European Commission their national recovery and resilience plans that are also part of this new wave of initiatives and activities that are going to be put in place to try to overcome this terrible situation. So let's analyze briefly these three opportunities and see what we can do to have the best out of those possibilities. Let's start from the economic rights and what has already been done, we have to say, because the emergency measures that the European Union this time had the capacity to put in place are incomparable if they are compared to what was done during the economic and financial crisis. Very little and very badly and very wrongly. On the contrary, the emergency measures that have been implemented now are really based on solidarity, are really based on Europe coming together to try to overcome this situation. Emergency measures to support public services and particularly healthcare services on the one side, but also on the other side to support the economy, businesses that have been hit by the pandemic, and of course, first and foremost, from our point of view as trade unions, to support workers, to make sure that these million and million workers that have been affected by the pandemic, by suspension from work, teleworking, and in some cases even unemployment, that all this doesn't end up into a major tragedy for employment and social rights in the European Union. We have at the moment almost 20 million workers that became unemployed because of the pandemic, but we have more than 40 million workers, more than the double, that are suspended from work because of this and are at risk of losing their jobs without emergency measures that have been deployed by the different member states. So this was very positive. This was very important not to repeat the mistakes that we had during the financial and economic crisis a decade ago. But still, there are problems even in the implementation of these measures, because not all categories of workers have been covered. Not all categories of companies and businesses have been helped by the emergency measures. There is still an effort to be made by the member states, by the European Union, to make sure that these emergency measures can continue long enough to help everybody, but can also see their scope and coverage enlarged in a way that no one is really left behind. But then the real challenge is how we design our recovery. And this time, it cannot be a jobless recovery. It cannot be a recovery that doesn't take into account the need to reinforce rights, the need to reinforce public services, particularly healthcare services, that doesn't take into account the need to tackle inequalities, fill the gaps in the labor market in terms of wages, in terms of rights, in terms of social protection. We need to use the recovery and resilience plans that each and every member state will put in place, that will be financed by the European Union with an extraordinary effort in this respect. We need to make sure that all this recovery strategy this time is fair, is inclusive, is protecting rights instead of undermining rights. Because what we have seen in the past is not at all the right example, the right practice that we have to follow this time. And in this respect, the three pillars that the European Union has put at the core of the recovery strategy, climate, digital, and social. These three pillars have to be enforced in practice. It's not enough to have good slogans at the core of the recovery strategy. It's absolutely necessary that for each and every euro that will be spent for investment, climate, digital, and social are really the compasses for this investment. We need to make sure that this time we can create enough good and quality jobs to make sure that all people will have a decent opportunity for employment. We have to make sure this time that investment will go for the protection of the environment. We have to make sure that this time the digital and climate transitions will really not leave anybody behind. Again, it cannot be only a slogan. And it cannot be only a matter of better skills, better training. All this is important, you know, but we cannot offer just training to people. We need to make sure that we have really investment that creates sustainable economic opportunities everywhere in Europe, in each and every community. We need to avoid to create again what we did in the past, economic and social deserts where we had transitions and restructuring processes going on. We need to make sure that everybody is involved in a governance process that can really make sure that we can build a more progressive and inclusive economy for the future. This is sustainability. Sustainability is also a matter of protecting rights. It's also a matter of providing the needed protection for everybody to be included in a decent and progressive process for the economy. And in this respect, I very much agree with Olivier de Schutter when he said that there is a need for radical reforms in the economic model of the European Union, because it was the wrong economic model based mainly on neoliberal theories and austerity that led to undermining rights, economic, social, and cultural rights in the European Union. The origin of our negative outcomes is the wrong economic policy that we have implemented so far. So a radical review of our economic governance, of our fiscal rules, of the Stability and Growth Pact, on all the even treaty-included rules that are at the core of this wrong economic policy. This is really crucial if we want to rebuild an economy that is based on respect of rights, an economy at the service of people. And of course, the second element of this is to make sure that the European Pillar of Social Rights is not just a nice paper with nice words and nice principles that are not turned into reality. How to transform these nice principles into binding rights, binding provisions is the real challenge that we have in Porto, but we will have also in the oncoming months and years when we are going to implement a series of legislative initiatives that the European Union is pushing forward. That's very important, but that we ask each and every member state to implement at the national level. It's very important to have a fundamental directive for decent minimum wages and stronger collective bargaining. It's very important to have a new directive on gender pay transparency to address the gender pay gap. It's fundamental, it will be fundamental to have a European directive to address platform work and to make sure that each and every self-employed or non-standard worker in Europe can be protected as the others are protected. It's fundamental to have a recommendation for universal social protection to be implemented by the member states. And we can continue. There are many initiatives that are very fundamental in this respect, but you know, if all these initiatives, if the pillar itself is not implemented through concrete action and legislation, real rights, enforceable rights at the national level, all this will simply, and again, remain nice slogans, nice propaganda. It's important to change the narrative, you know, but it's not enough. That's why it's so relevant to have a social summit discussing the action plan for the implementation of this pillar. When we proclaimed this pillar 3.5 years ago in Gothenburg, well, it was really a nice paper, but now it has to become a reality. And this is the best way to defend social rights in the future in the European Union, and to make sure that also the rights that are enshrined in the different charters become reality, even in the European treaties. That's why, for instance, we, as the European Trade Union Confederation, are fighting for a social progress protocol to be included in the treaties, to make sure that social rights have the same level of importance as economic freedoms whenever a court case happens, but also for the European pillar of social rights to be part of the treaties in a way that it becomes really a binding tool for social Europe in the future. And finally, last but not least, you mentioned cultural rights in the title of these initiatives. And cultural rights means first and foremost democratic rights. Democratic rights in the European Union at the moment are really under threat, because there are too many countries, even governments, that are not respecting the rule of law. There are too many countries where the right of expression, the right to speech, even the right to strike, the right of demonstration are under threat. There are too many countries where people are not protected in terms of their privacy, in terms of their data, of their personal rights and freedoms. So there is really the need, even in the framework of the discussion about the conference on the future of Europe, to make sure that we can really enforce individual rights, freedoms, and democratic rights in the European Union. And when it comes to this, from a trade union perspective, of course, it's fundamental that also workers' rights are considered, are basic and fundamental democratic rights. Social dialogue, civil dialogue, collective bargaining, workers' participation, these elements are part of economic and social democracy. Democracy is not only a formal value. Democracy has to happen in the reality. And the reality is the economy, is the society, is the labor market, is the workplace. In these places, we need to make sure that rights are really implemented and enforced immediately. We cannot continue just saying, okay, we will do it, okay, we have good intentions, okay, we have made maybe some mistakes in the past, and then we don't act to correct these mistakes. We don't act to implement these rights in the reality. This is really the great challenge we had in front of us. So I really think that initiatives like this go in the right direction and help a lot to make sure that the institutional frameworks, such as the recovery strategy of the European Union, the Porto Summit and the action plan for the pillar, and the conference on the future of Europe, that in these institutional frameworks also civil society, economic and social actors can make a difference and can really make a progress. All together we can win this battle, but we have to be consistent and we have to be active. So thank you very much again for having me here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now listen to Jean-Marc Coirin, Secretary General at the Ligue d'Enseignement and President of the European Civic Forum. Not listening. Eu não sei se ele me ouvirá. We cannot hear you. There's some problem with your sound, I think. It's probably not on.
You are muted.
Okay, it's okay now, sorry.
Yes, now we listen perfectly. Thank you.
Thanks to have invited the Civil Society Europe. How to ensure an effective and equitable recovery and to realize human rights, in particular economic, social and cultural rights, without leaving no one behind. That's the real question for me. We are only now starting to measure the impact of the crisis on the societies, while many of the measures have tried to address and alleviate the economic impact. We also need to look at the other dimensions and how the crisis has affected our social, cultural, and human rights. In particular, we can say that our ability to enjoy non-economic rights have been the most affected, and that people that were already in situations of exclusion or discriminations have been particularly affected. This includes, of course, access to essential social, but also health services, access to culture, as well as all to formal and non-formal education. Together with the loss of income and perspectives, the deprivations of these rights have meant isolation and loss of hope for many people in Europe and in the world. Also, a society where education and culture and all the non-material dimensions are neglected is a society that heads inevitably towards decline and with the risk of totalitarianism, as history has shown us. The possibility of collective engagement and participation have also been limited, and our civic rights have been often denied. Yet civil society organizations have been extremely active during the pandemic to put in place responses to the crisis by reaching those that have been left behind. More in general, civil society organizations are key actors in providing care and lifelong learning, empowering citizens that are excluded, persons with disabilities, migrants, persons from ethnic minorities, and championing equality. First of all, there must be cooperation with civil society in designing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating measures. This is not done enough. If we look at the design of the recovery package first at EU level and the preparation of the national recovery and resilience plans, we have a serious gap. The process has been largely untransparent with late-stage consultations, which were hardly taken into account in the final drafts, as documented in our study in the participation of civil society in the preparation of the EU national recovery and resilience plans. The summit offers a unique opportunity to launch a new dynamic pushing member states to work together so that to ensure everyone has access to social, economic, and cultural rights. This means being ambitious and going beyond arguments of subsidiarity and the real commitment and engagement. We need a social deal. We need a cultural deal. Culture is what brings people together. It helps us to understand the past and determines the future of our societies. Culture has been considered disposable during this crisis. Yet we need culture to make our societies free, equitable. We need to sustain from bottom up the cultural sector, and mainstreaming cultural policies is a priority dimension in policy thinking and funds allocation. For the successful implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights and the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, it is of utmost importance that the policy recommendations of the European Commission to the Member States are in line with and conducive to achieving these social and sustainable goals. It is therefore worrisome that despite the introduction of the social scoreboard, the country-specific recommendations continue to center around macroeconomic indicators and fail to put Europe's social objectives at their core. The action plan on the social pillar for social rights should be endorsed at a minimum, but more ambitious national targets should be put in place. The European semester should have a more prominent social dimension. This is even more important for the 2021 cycle, as the national recovery and resilience plans will be included in the process. Thanks for the invitation and your attention.
Thank you very much. We finished this group of interventions with the Portuguese researcher and professor at the School of Law, Nova University, expert in human rights, Teresa Pissarro Beleza. Please.
Thank you. I have been listening carefully to all of you, and I have been thinking, not just from listening to you all, but from, of course, reading all the documents and thinking about the purpose of this meeting today, and of course of the upcoming Porto meeting, that on the one hand, we have all these beautiful declarations, all these beautiful slogans that somebody else mentioned before. I'm now referring in particular to the document on the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan. And the promise seems to be a union of equality. I'm quoting from the document. And there is also, there are all these statements and promises and commitments to address not just inequalities and discrimination, but also the stereotypes in terms of gender and so on and so forth, and work-life balance. And of course, the European Union is supposed to fight poverty, and Olivier de Schutter, my colleague from many years in the Venice connection, let's use this expression, called our attention to the existence of over 90 million poor people and working people often in Europe. It happens partly in Portugal as well. And what I see after looking, or what I think after having looked at all these declarations and promises and statements and action plans, is people drowning at sea, crossing the Mediterranean, looking for a better life, people asking for asylum being refused, and of course, all these working poor, often with a female face, because in Europe and all over the world, poverty is mostly feminine. So we have the problem, the issue of gender dimension in here. But it somehow goes beyond this, because what the sight of the people drowning in the Mediterranean on the one hand, and on the other, situations like the present day migrants in Odemir in the south of my country make me think of, is that also because of the pandemic, but also because of the many economic crises and the way the European Union has been unable to deal with them, partly because of the neoliberal beliefs and policies, makes me think of the possibility of Europe not just becoming, but also having already a side or an outlook of a nomad land. And I'm of course referring to the movie that has just won the Oscars in Hollywood or wherever it was. I think it was somewhere else. So although I am, I think, an optimistic sort of person, it is also the case that because I am an academic, I tend to look at things, first of all, from a critical perspective, and as serious as I am able to do so. So I would say that since we all believe that there is no democracy without economic, social, and cultural rights, and because we cannot separate them from the other rights, the so-called civil and political and so on and so forth, unless Europe is actually the European Union, and actually Europe as well, of course. The Council of Europe has also been mentioned mostly by Olivier de Schutter, and the way in which the European Union still somehow refuses to acknowledge its natural sisterhood, I would say, with the Council of Europe, unless the European Union is really committed and decided to put all these lovely statements and promises and slogans in real life, then I would say maybe I should consider stopping my vote to the European Parliament, because somehow I sometimes feel that my belief in the European integration and the progress that has been promised has not been fulfilled. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you for sharing your thoughts and profound knowledge on the human rights topic that have brought us many topics to discuss and I think many questions. It is now clear that the pandemic uncovered structural poverty in the EU, that social rights must be seen as what they are, rights, and that there is a need for legislation against discrimination. Social poverty needs safety nets, and that is a way to address poverty. We also need to be aware not to repeat mistakes from the past, and not let go of opportunities like the digital transition that should not leave anyone behind. Economy needs to be at service of people, and it is not enough to change the narrative. Isolation and loss of hope has been one of the consequences of the pandemic, and Europe is in danger of becoming a nomad's land if nothing will be done in a near future. These are some of the key ideas that have been brought to us. We will now have time for debate, and I will start with questions from the public that have been sent to us. And the first one will go to Professor Teresa Beleza. The question that has come to us is, health is at the core of social rights. Nevertheless, its budget seems to be never enough. What can be done?
I am not sure whether the question is about the Portuguese or the European Union capabilities, let's say, financial capabilities. So whether it's one or the other, I would say claim from your government. That's the answer.
Short and simple. Thank you very much. We have another question to Olivier de Schutter. And the question is, could you please develop what would be cultural rights? How could they be implemented? I don't know if we still have him on board. Maybe not. So we can go ahead to another question, and if he comes back, I will repeat the question. So we also have a question for Virginia Braz Gomes, which is the situation of homeless people is getting worse and its number increasing. What can be done to tackle this challenge?
Thank you very much for the question. I think when we speak of homelessness, we speak of a number of flaws in our housing policies. It is because probably in many countries, and even in my own country, we do not have enough social housing. There is a lot of territorial discrimination in terms of neighborhoods that have concentrated migrant groups and where there is limited access to quality services, there's limited access to employment opportunities. So there is a whole lack of exercise of the right to housing. And I think the last stage is when people become homeless. Of course, we know that homelessness has other reasons related to mental health issues, drug addiction problems. But I would consider that when you look at housing policies, you need to look at them in an integrated manner within the other social policies. This is what interdependence of rights is all about. But if you want a concrete answer, I think we need to invest more in social housing. We need to invest more in enabling enabling certain neighborhoods with better access to opportunities and resources. And we have a strategy to combat homelessness, which hopefully will provide some results.
Thank you very much. We have another question for Luca Vizentini. European workers need to work with fair salaries, allowing them to have a dignified life. What can be done in this regard? Which are your expectations for the Social Summit of Porto?
Well, European workers have been, I've seen their wages cut and undermined by the austerity measures implemented in the past, and wages are diverging even further now instead of converging, as was our expectation on the contrary. So there is really need for immediate action to make sure that we can have real upward convergence in terms of wage developments in the European Union. By the way, this will not be benefiting only workers and social justice, but also the capacity of our economy to be more resilient and more competitive. Having a well-developed wage increases will help also competitiveness and productivity. How to achieve this is, of course, very complex. We think that this proposed new directive for decent minimum wages and collective bargaining is a fundamental tool that can be achieved. But, you know, increasing minimum wages is not enough. Increasing statutory minimum wages helps people out of poverty, but doesn't contribute substantially to increase the wage mass and to make sure that we can have upward convergence. The only way to achieve this result is to strengthen collective bargaining at sectoral level in each and every country. And at the moment, there are only 11 countries out of 27 where sectoral collective agreements are really covering the majority of workers in the European Union. So we need really to make a great effort in Europe to strengthen collective bargaining. Collective bargaining has been mainly dismantled during the last decade, so we have to reconstruct our collective bargaining institutions and make sure that really people, workers, can bargain for decent salaries. This is a fundamental element in this respect.
Thank you very much. There's another question for you, so if you could please stay in line. What is the reason for the EU to be unwilling to refer to international standards in the field of social rights?
Sorry, I miss your voice for a moment.
Oh,
can you repeat
sorry.
the question?
Of course. What is the reason for the EU to be unwilling to refer to international standards in the field of social rights?
Yeah, this is a this is a long-standing problem. You know, the European Union very often refuses to be part of international legal frameworks when it comes to social rights, not only for social rights, by the way. The European Union, for instance, has always refused to ratify ILO Convention itself, has always left all this responsibility to member states, has always refused to incorporate the Social Charter and the institutional framework of the Council of Europe in its own social acquis. Olivier de Schutter was mentioning this earlier on today. This is a wrong interpretation, we think, of the link between the European treaties and legal frameworks and the international obligations. And this is something that should be corrected. It is not by refusing to be part of a broader institutional framework that the European Union will reinforce its capacity to deliver rights and legal frameworks at the European level. This element is something that is really wrong from our point of view and should be really, really corrected. The reason why probably the European Commission has always been very prudent in this respect is that the member states, as in many fields, are always trying, to reduce as much as possible the competences of the European Union to gain sovereignty and subsidiarity on their own. But this is not helping in reinforcing the European role in the world. On the contrary, is undermining the potential of the European Union to play a positive role in this respect. We really hope that very soon, this approach will change.
Thank you very much. I now have a more general question to all of you that can still participate with us, and that is, what are your expectations to the Porto Social Summit? I maybe start with the ones present here in the room. Virginia, please.
Well, I know that when we adopted in Gothenburg, we adopted the European Social Pillar. It was a huge, at the time, there was a lot of excitement, there was a lot of aspirations for the pillar. But somehow that whole creative energy seems to have kind of dwindled till now. But I hope with the plan of action that the member states will show some political will to really put the plan of action into place. I think what happened to us during the austerity periods and what happened to us during COVID now, I think is a clear indication of how important the social pillar is. So if there is really political will to make kind of reverse the losses we've made so far and really give the pillar some impetus, I think there's enough food for thought lying around. There are enough creative proposals. What we need is for states and European member states really to understand once and for all that social, economic and cultural rights are as important as civil and political rights. And that kind of assurance has taken a long time coming. So maybe the Porto Summit will be the place to bring it together.
Thank you very much. I'll go again maybe to our starting point. Maurice Dubussy, would you like to give us your thoughts on what you expect from the Social Summit?
Yes, with pleasure. Well, this is what I have somehow referred in my introductory remarks. What has been said so far by colleagues around this panel has been all relevant. The reaffirmation of rights, the linkages between employment, social protection, social dialogue, fundamental principles and rights of work, which is the essence of the ILO set of instruments, is certainly part of the Euro system, but there is an incredible opportunity here to make sure that all this body of international law, of international principles and rights of work are firmly embedded as part of, as a core element of the action plan. We see it happening already at the level of the recovery plans that countries are putting forward. Some of these elements are surfacing, but they have to be much more stringently applied, whether it's legally binding or any other instruments that the European Union will consider appropriate. It's important to have really a close connectivity between what is the body of principles and rights, which are part of international labor standards, and the way they are applied and executed at the national level through the action plan. So we believe that this will be clearly a critical point in the way the European pillar will be operationalized through the action plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Jean-Marc Roirin, would you like to comment, give some ideas? I'm not sure if we still have him. Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
I have a dream. I hope that in the summit we can be present, the civil society actors. How can we imagine to build happiness without the people? We ask to be present in the conference for the future of Europe, and the institution refused. So my hope is to be present at the summit, Porto, and I congratulate you, and I thank you to invite in this meeting. It's symbolically very important for us. So I await the recognition of the role and the place of civil society actors in the future.
Thank you very much. Professora Teresa Beleza, would you like to give us some thoughts on what you expect from the Porto Social Summit, if anything?
I always expect a lot, if you don't believe me. Well, to start with, it just happens that I was born in Porto, which is not very relevant, but it makes the city particularly dear to me. And it also happens, and maybe this is not known by many of my colleagues here present, let me call you this way, in an affectionate manner, that the city of Porto has a very long tradition of democratic resistance, Republican resistance, and so on and so forth. So it's a very interesting place to have this summit. My hope is that in this summit in Porto, the European Union and its member states will take their proposals and promises and statements and plans and so on and so forth seriously, really seriously. That's my hope. And that means to accept that the European Union in many instances and in many contexts, as it were, does need to accept the idea that there is a strong need for structural changes, not just the European Union, but of course the member states. And when one looks at the general political situation, and we can just stay, as it were, in the territory of the European Union, and we look at the gender rights backlash and the backlash on democratic values in some parts of the European Union. On the one hand, we may think that there is not much reason for hope, but on the other hand, we should think that because the situation is hard and difficult, we have, all of us, to put a lot of pressure on our governments and on, I would say, the government, in quotes, of the European Union. That's my hope for my hometown, Porto. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's the hope of all of us. I will end this group of, well, time of question, because we are reaching towards the end. I would like myself to put a question to Mr. Secretary of State, using the words from, also from, or the thoughts, or the worries from Professora Beleza. I think we all live with this paradox nowadays of having in our heads the images of the refugees drowning, so it's not possible to ignore. And as a decision maker, what can you tell us that could be done in the near future using, of course, this summit.
Well, thank you very much. As Professor already mentioned about our expectations, what we hope to see, and I think this is partially the conclusion of this morning and definitely the expectation that we have towards the next Friday in Porto, is that this social summit may constitute not only a turning point, but the logic following of what happened in Gothenburg, and also, as Professor Virginia Gras-Gomes mentioned, today the times that we are living showed us that the European social pillar is more necessary than ever. If something became clear during these last 12 months that we have been living, is that the need for the state to assure more mechanisms in terms of equality, in terms of providing services to people, to the most needed, definitely. So our hopes are that either dealing with the crisis in the Mediterranean, with the migration crisis or the migration flows, what we really hope is that Porto might be a turning point and give us the conditions to put some pressure on all the political actors and decision makers at European level to give the necessary boost to the social pillar to have the same importance for the citizens as we have today for the political and civil rights.
Thank you very much. So I think it's we would all agree that there is great expectation on this summit, which is great, but also a big responsibility. Unfortunately, our time is almost up, but we still have a last intervention that will come from Gabriel Bastos, Portuguese Social Security Secretary of State. Please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I would like to greet all participants and especially today's speakers for their highly interesting and inspiring insights. Dear colleague Francisco André, thank you very much for giving me the honor and the pleasure to close this high-level working session. The issue of investment related to the economic, social and cultural rights is, of course, at the core of the main priorities of the Portuguese presidency of the Council of the European Union, namely a resilient Europe based on cohesion, on its principles and its values, and the social Europe based on an enhanced and strengthened European social model. In this morning's session, measures aiming at an effective and equitable recovery, whilst ensuring the implementation of economic, social and cultural rights were widely discussed. This in-depth and fruitful debate has been a valuable contribution for the Porto Social Summit and has more broadly brought relevant insights to public policy design. As the Secretary of State mentioned in his opening remarks, we did indeed take a series of wide-ranging and diverse measures aimed at ensuring the necessary adaptation of social benefits, namely sickness benefits, to the specific needs brought by the emergency, like the obligation to undergo quarantine or to self-isolate. But as we also know, this is not exclusively a health crisis, but also an economic and social crisis. Therefore, a special attention had to be given from the outset to the labour markets with the aim at supporting companies to retain workers, namely through short-time work benefits. Additionally, considering the economic restrictions that had to be put in place, and as the liquidity constraints experienced by enterprises, other type of approaches were taken so as to alleviate those pressures, like allowing enterprises to postpone the payment of social insurance contributions and taxes. Despite the critical policy response to the emergency and the related crisis, from a short and medium-term perspective, it is also essential to keep our focus on the pressing societal issues and great challenges we must address, as Virginia has underlined. This means that our eyes must also be set on the future. Besides the twin green and digital transitions, Portugal, as several other European partners, faces a set of structural challenges that must be dealt with in the following years and decades. First, the demographic challenge. The aging of the population poses significant challenges to social protection, services and care provided for the elderly, but especially to the financial sustainability of social security systems, without, of course, forgetting the adequacy dimension of the same systems, which means acceptable level of protection. In this context, raising the birth rate, promoting work and family life conciliation, and diversifying social security financing sources are top priorities of our government. Secondly, the agenda for an inclusive and fair labour market, including decent wages and reduced inequalities in the primary distribution of income, is an indispensable dimension of the policy mix. Last but not least, the reduction of poverty and inequalities, along with the promotion of human dignity, reinforcing the culture of decent work and a sense of belonging to the local and global community, demanding rapid, effective and innovative responses at the European, national, regional and local levels. The Action Plan for the Implementation of the European Pillar of Social Rights offers us a concrete toolbox to tackle these major challenges. In the unprecedented times we are living in, the Action Plan places the social dimension where it belongs, at the center of the climate and digital transitions, drivers of economic and social recovery. And that is also the main goal of the Porto Social Summit, cornerstone of our presidency, to move from principles to action, giving political impetus to the implementation of the Action Plan for the European Pillar of Social Rights. It is, in fact, time to move from words, statements, to concrete action. To underline the central role of equality, fairness, inclusion and social cohesion in the European recovery, to ensure that we face the challenges of the present and of the future, leaving no one behind. In a nutshell, to renew our commitment to social Europe. Together, we must be able to build paths of progress in which everyone can enjoy its benefits. And for that to happen, economic, social and cultural rights must advance at the same pace in a road towards progress, fairness, inclusion and solidarity, of course. The Portuguese presidency wants to contribute to achieve those goals, setting new milestones in our common endeavour. So let me conclude by quoting the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa. Europe lies reclining upon her elbows. From east to west, she stretches, staring. Enigmatic and faithful, she stares out west to the future of the past. The staring face is Portugal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary of State. Ending with poetry gives us at least hope that something will be better in the near future. I will just give some very, very short final remarks, reminding that Portugal has a long tradition on the topic of human rights, and that the post-pandemic times call for courage in the fight against inequalities. I think that has become very clear from all the interventions. And so we hope this webinar has been an inspiration to the Social Summit, and that will bring effective and real measures. On behalf of the National Commission for Human Rights and the Portuguese Presidency of the European Council, a special thank you to all participants and listeners. Muito obrigado, and as we say in the interior of Portugal, bem-ajam. Thank you.